5. The default position of many of our broadcasters is deflection and denial.
4.
I don't think that those are properly understood as, in the main, at least, and perhaps at all, as a response to the mini budget. Whereas I think at the time, policymakers thought that it was. That was just wrong.
3.
This is going to cause a huge ruction. And why is it that Labour won't allow this public inquiry?
2. There aren't many more stories more worthy of national headlines, are there, than co-pilot Halligan versus co-pilot Pearson.
1. We have liftoff.
Welcome back to a whole new year of Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Allison Pearson.
Hello.
And me, Liam Halligan. Well, 2025 has started with a bang, co-pilot. The Christmas decorations are barely down, and yet the season of political goodwill, such as it was, is well and truly over. A new Delta poll survey suggests that with Labour having taken office only in July, some 69% of voters think the UK is heading in the wrong direction, and a third, no less, think that Starmer won't be Prime Minister by the end of this new year. There have been a series of unforced errors, from the controversial removal of winter fuel payments to steep incoming tax rises, and now the so-called grooming gang scandal has exploded after Safeguarding Minister Jess Phillips failed to explain adequately why she won't agree to a proper inquiry into the multiple rapes and depraved abuses of predominantly white girls in so many northern towns, disproportionately at the hands of men of Pakistani origin. Much of the public is quite rightly incensed, a groundswell of utter outrage that you captured, Allison, in what, if I may say so, is one of the most powerful newspaper columns I've read after 30 years in journalism. It's in Wednesday's Telegraph and on our website, of course, link in the show notes to this episode. Why will there finally be no public inquiry into an utter scandal that's driven shaming headlines not just across Britain, but across the world? Could it be something to do with the fact that so many of the councils that turned a blind eye on the grounds of political correctness, not wanting to be accused of racism, were and still are Labour councils? Could it be the actions of one Keir Starmer when he was Director of Public Prosecutions at the Crown Prosecution Service? It's a sordid episode, co-pilot, and much of the wrongdoing is ongoing. On top of that, our warning of winter blackouts are edging ever closer. We've got our mid-1970s power cut kits at the ready, including torches and candles. And Planet Normal has an exclusive story relating to former Prime Minister Liz Truss, current Prime Minister Starmer, the bond market, and claims that, quotes, Truss crashed the economy. All will be revealed after we've discussed this ghastly grooming rape scandal and after we've revealed the results of the great Planet Normal post-Christmas weigh-in. A bit of light and shade before we get into the realities of what's going on, Allison. So come on then, scores on the doors.
There aren't many more stories more worthy of national headlines, are there, than co-pilot Halligan versus co-pilot Pearson, who has shrunk further and faster. Who is occupying less space in the cockpit on the
Come on then, let's hear it then.
Well, I thought Christmas was going to be a disaster, obviously, because I actually ate some food, which I have given up for several months now. But I am now down to 9 stone, 9 pounds from just over 12 stone. And I have lost 20%, Halligan, of my body weight. Where's it gone?
That's outrageous. Well, you, of course, have been using what you call Fatty's Little Helper, the slender handrail of Ozempic, which you've written about. Manjaro, sorry. So I had a really bad year last year, as you know, for many reasons.
Yeah.
I've always been, a big lad. I'm 6'4". I've been a oarsman of some repute, as they say. When we started our weight loss competition, my 6'4" frame was carrying 130 kilos, which is quite a lot. And I'm now 113 kilos, 112 as of this morning, 112. I have lost 13% of my body weight, right? So I think I've lost more than you in absolute terms, but as a percentage, and on this measure, I gladly declare you the victor. As a percentage of your body weight, you have lost more than me. So there it is. We've got to keep this going, co-pilot, into the new year.
Let's just say that over the Christmas period, co-pilot Halligan came round to Pearson
I brought you a Christmas
Towers.
present.
You did, a lovely Christmas present, and I ambushed you with the Pearson sherry trifle.
Ambushed
Let's
me?
be honest.
Crikey. I was in the corner tied up and you were force-feeding me. You got the funnel out.
You came back for thirds.
And of course, this is your Pearson famous class war trifle, because while you've got your homemade Nigella custard with about 15 eggs in it, you basically start out with cheapy dick sponge fingers and tinned fruit at the bottom, don't you? As we had in our childhood homes.
Yes.
And that is you in a bowl, in a trifle.
It really is. So the Nigella trifle, which of course specifies very upmarket ingredients like frozen Waitrose winter fruits, which I do put in, but then I can't really, truth be told, I always prefer cheap stuff to expensive stuff.
The staleness of the sponge fingers is just a top note throughout the trifle, isn't it?
I bung in the tin of fruit cocktail, which, as you know, Liam, when we were kids, that really was what fruit was, wasn't it? I mean, a fruit bowl didn't have any of your light cheese.
We used to dream of eating bananas.
It's a dream of eating bananas. Yeah, absolutely. So very, very successful. I think we've both done well, actually, and we both, for different reasons, had a pretty tough year. I think we're both very glad to say goodbye. You know, I think a listener said 2024 can F off. And I think whoever that was, I share your sentiment. But let's hoping all our wonderful listeners that this is going to be a better year. Although, let's just start with, you might remember, Liam, that 2024 started with the Mr. Bates and the Post Office docudrama, which was astonishing and prompted huge national soul searching about the Post Office Horizon scandal, which made all the headlines quite rightly. And 2025 is starting off similarly with what I think many people believe to be the greatest national scandal in British history. People will have been following the headlines over the last few days, but I should warn you that a lot of, particularly the TV news, the reflex of people when we have what were known as grooming gangs, but grooming is actually what we do to dogs, isn't it? This is child rape gangs, and the default position of many of our broadcasters is deflection and denial. So what you might have seen on the television won't probably have given you the whole picture, because in a nutshell, Liam, Jess Phillips, who you mentioned, the safeguarding minister, ruled out a national inquiry that was being asked for by Oldham, one of the more notorious scenes of these Pakistani origin Muslim rape gangs. And Jess Phillips says, no, we're not having another national inquiry. Oldham Council can do it itself. So Labour is saying we don't need another national inquiry. All we need is to implement the recommendations of the Alexis J report of 2022. But Liam, the J report, listeners might like to grasp this distinction, that's about child sexual abuse, CSA. What we are talking about with these thousands and thousands of white girls who have been subject to sadistic sexual abuse and torture, that's called GLCSE, which is group localized child sexual exploitation. And that is obviously the unbelievably depraved, widespread desecration of young female children across our country in the last 15 years. And I would say we agree with Kemi Badenoch and the leader of the Conservative Party, who is now campaigning for a national inquiry. We're recording on Wednesday afternoon, Liam, and they are voting in the House of Commons for whether a national inquiry into the rape gang should be included in this child safeguarding bill.
And Labour, of course, are whipping their MPs to vote against.
They certainly are. But just quickly saying, this technique that we've all been exposed to for many years now is when something like this crops up, immediately the left, the liberal intelligentsia and the left wing try to shut it down. So we had Stephen Kinnock on Newsnight, language that whips up violent sentiment. Now, I looked at Stephen Kinnock and I thought, yeah, well, you can worry about language that whips up violent sentiment. How about worrying about a 12-year-old girl upstairs above a kebab shop being raped by a man, and 20 of his close relations are waiting downstairs to take their turn with the 12-year-old girl. So we see this disgusting moral disconnect between crimes which absolutely beggar belief and the political class, which is desperately struggling now to preserve the multicultural project, the anti-racism project, which spread from the police to local authorities to Parliament. And I would argue, Liam, created the fertile conditions in which these girls could be attacked by predators who thought that because they were white, they were dirty, not modest. White girls are lower than cattle. Some people may remember Jack Straw, Home Secretary in the new Labour government, said that his Pakistani male constituents, some of them regarded white girls as easy meat. So we've got this, just to bring us right up to date, we've got this national calamity attracting, as you said in your introduction, international incredulity. This is the country of Shakespeare and English and Downton Abbey. Suddenly turns out to be this cesspit in which thousands of the nation's children were abused. So into the horror show comes the world's richest man, Elon Musk. Musk had read Charlie Peters' excellent reports for GB News. Also, we should mention the Telegraph's own Sam Ashworth-Hayes. He's also been digging like mad. And Musk came across what you and I shared, Liam, a few over the weekend, with the judge's remarks at the trial of several Pakistani men who had raped and tortured girls.
Absolutely astonishing reading. We've put the link in the show notes to this episode.
Yeah.
We say to Planet Normal listeners, read with care.
Yeah.
It's quite depraved.
It is. And I think that when you read, we hear the word rapes, but when I was reading the judge's remarks about what happened to those young girls, I thought of wartime atrocities. This is the way that an invading army behaves with the women folk of their defeated enemy. So Musk, having read this stuff, his grandmother was from Liverpool, a working class girl. He said she would have been the kind of girl who would have been prey for these people. So he tweeted his fury and disbelief that politicians like Jess Phillips, Keir Starmer, should be in jail for what was allowed to happen to all these girls. Now, Keir Starmer's response earlier this week, even by his tone-deaf standards extraordinary, was to say that anyone calling for a national inquiry was guilty of jumping on the far-right bandwagon. So again, another example of let's not name the guilty men. God, no, because that would offend Muslim voters who overwhelmingly support Labour. I just say, Liam, I'm just going to hand over to you now, but many of the women survivors, some of whom have been in touch with me, say they want full accountability. They want the full disgusting extent of what happened to them and to thousands of girls around the country to be revealed to the British people.
Alison, I've known you for quite a few years now, and we've talked about this so much. I know this has really burned a hole in your soul, this story. I know I've seen it up front and personal. I've seen people attack you for being Islamophobic, for raising this issue. And this is an issue which has really struck a chord with me over many years as well. When I was a young reporter in Parliament in mid and late 1990s, I came across the excellent Labour MP for Keighley, Anne Cryer, whose son, of course, is John Cryer, who was MP for an East London constituency. Really solid, good Labour people. And we know many good Labour people, don't we? We're not having a go at the Labour Party per se, whatever some people may say about one or both of us. And I remember talking to Anne Cryer, who's still around, And if she does listen to this podcast,
Yeah.
all power to her elbow. She was desperately trying to raise this issue, which she had seen in her Yorkshire constituency of Keighley, which was previously the constituency of her husband, the then late Bob Cryer. She wanted to carry on his work. She was elected on a local landslide. And her party machine kept rebuffing her, kept saying that she was racist, kept threatening her, and she carried on and she carried on. And Anne Cryer has a modern day counterpart, I would say, in Sarah Champion, another Labour MP,
Yes.
champion by name, champion by nature. Again, a Labour MP I enormously admire, because she had to resign from her frontbench position under Corbyn because she wrote in The Sun the simple words, "Britain has a problem with rape gangs of Pakistani origin." She was forced to apologise. She was forced to resign from her position. And she's still not on the Labour front bench, despite her resolute position on this most crucial of all issues. I feel so kind of semi-unqualified to talk about this as a man, if I'm honest. It's not my usual style to go down this line of argument. Obviously, you know, I have two beloved daughters,
Yes.
and these things really chime with me. But I know you as a woman have felt this so strongly in your bones. And I just don't know where this story is now going to go. As we record, the Commons is debating whether or not there should be, in the context of a broader piece of legislation, Kemi Badenoch has taken the step of tabling an amendment to the legislation, the Child Safety Bill, in order to push for a full public inquiry. How many Labour MPs are going to rebel? How many Labour MPs are going to rebel against Downing Street's diktat that they must vote against that full public inquiry, even though, as you've pointed out over recent days, the obvious point to me, but a salient point, that a lot of the councils involved are Labour councils. And so what can local MPs do if they're going against their own councils? This is going to cause a huge ruction. And why is it that Labour won't now allow this public inquiry?
We know why it is, Liam. We know why it is, because a huge part of their ideology rests on this diversity is our strength. Now, I would say that is utterly wrong, right? Because unity is our strength, right? People coming to our country, absorbing our values. We've talked many times about what an amazingly accommodating society ours is. Some people might say too much, but generally we rub along and do pretty well at embracing new groups of people. But as Robert Jenrick has been saying in the last few days, and, you know, getting a huge amount of stick for it, if you have people coming in huge numbers who hold what Jenrick called medieval attitudes towards women, then you're going to have a big problem. And he also talked about alien cultures. Now, I don't know, I occasionally, for my sins, watch Channel 4 News, which, although politically I don't agree with it, I think they've got some of the best reporters, journalists, is excellent. And Cassie Newman, in fact, she invited me on. I didn't go. Luckily, Halligan, I'd have self-combusted on the spot, wouldn't I? But
So
anyway,
what you're saying is, Allison...
So Cassie Newman basically was ranting about Jenrick having said that so-called alien, she said, how dare you describe these as alien cultures and imply that we shouldn't allow immigrants in from places which have alien values. And what I would have said to Cassie Newman is, yeah, not all cultures are equal, honey. So alien cultures where they have child marriage, alien cultures where women are not regarded as equal, alien cultures where men force women to be covered and don't allow women to be unaccompanied outside the house, alien cultures that practice female genital mutilation, alien cultures that ban homosexuality or punish homosexuals and gay people with whipping or indeed the death penalty. So I'm afraid, Liam, at the heart of this issue are the young women who have seen their rapists often get derisory sentences. I got an email whose primary rapist, the guy who organised the gang that abused her, has now out of prison after an absurdly light sentence. I actually would have wanted him executed. And he's now back in Rotherham and standing at the bottom of her garden path, right? Can you imagine that? That many of these women who were girls, they were 11, 12, 13, they've got PTSD, they've got depression, they're in a terrible state. Now, one thing that I did manage this week, which I thought was incredibly interesting for Planet Normal listeners, was I got into a discussion with an excellent former MP.
Yeah.
Lucy Allen was the Conservative MP for Telford from 2015. She lost her seat at the general election. Now, Lucy became the MP for Telford, which is another notorious centre of these Pakistani origin rape gangs. And Lucy she's a good person. She started trying to raise these issues in Parliament. And she said the pushback was intense. Coordinated response in the town. Lucy Allen now free to deliver a brutally honest verdict. And this is what she said to me. The people in power believed that being honest about what had happened to the girls would fuel racial tensions. They pushed a narrative that hiding the problem was in the interest of the community, that looking the other way would cement social cohesion and protect society. Lucy said to me that she knows that narrative, for a fact, was pushed by Home Office officials. She said she now looks on and watches as junior ministers, both Labour and Conservative shadow ministers, spin the same line almost word for word, clearly at the behest of civil servants.
Now on to our first guest of 2025. Planet Normal can exclusively reveal that lawyers acting for former Prime Minister Liz Truss have written a formal cease and desist request to current Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Truss is trying to prevent Starmer and her other political opponents from continuing to claim that, quotes, Liz Truss crashed the economy. This, of course, harks back to the infamous mini-budget of September 2022, delivered by then-Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng, when Truss was in number 10 herself. And since then, Liz Truss crashed the economy has become a political truism, used repeatedly not only by Labour, but by much of the media, and also some of Truss's Tory opponents as well. The reality is, though, that many economists and market analysts simply don't buy this analysis. Yes, following the Truss-Kwarteng pledge to spend heavily on energy subsidies in the aftermath of spikes in oil and gas prices, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in the spring of 2022, along with proposed tax cuts in the mini-budget, yields on government bonds and subsequently the cost of mortgages and other loans did rise. Yet that was happening in many other countries as well at the same time. And the UK economy actually grew in the aftermath of the mini-budget, faster than previously predicted by the Bank of England. That's hardly a crash. Plus, the Bank of England has since published a little noticed report suggesting that around 2/3 of the rise in borrowing costs in the autumn of 2022 was caused by the LDI crisis, the impact of inflation and rising interest rates on so-called liability-driven investments, which were nothing at all to do with Truss. And on top of that, even though all of Truss's proposals were reversed, sparking a political crisis that drummed her out of office, of course, and even though the Bank of England has lowered base rates twice over the last 6 months, from 5.25% to 4.75%, actual borrowing costs in the markets have surged over the same period. They're now much higher than levels which caused a political meltdown during the autumn of 2022. As investors become increasingly alarmed at Labour's additional borrowing and spending and the impact of tax rises on the overall growth of the economy. This is complex stuff, dear listeners, but of huge financial and political importance. Some will keep saying that Truss is just bitter and should accept she lost office. Others will contest that no, her ideas about lowering the tax burden and deregulating the economy were correct, and she and her policies have been wrongly traduced for ideological reasons by big state media commentators and civil servants whose ideas will drive the UK economy over the edge. That's why we asked Dr. Andrew Lilico onto the rocket, Telegraph columnist and a widely respected business-focused economist, someone who I can confirm really knows the ins and outs of financial markets. Andrew's Managing Director of Europe Economics, a consultancy providing an analysis for a wide range of international bodies and corporate clients. He's also been Chief Economist of the think tank Policy Exchange. In this context, Andrew was asked to submit a detailed technical report into the events of autumn 2022 as part of Liz Truss's legal submission to Starmer, a report which I read closely before talking to him.
What happened in September, October 2022 was certainly significant financial market events. So we had a very large spike in the yields, that's the kind of interest rate that's paid on 30-year government bonds, the long-term government bonds in the UK. And it was a very unusual large spike that occurred there. And that led to some panic, I think, basically in policymaking circles. They didn't understand at the time why it had occurred. It took them some months really to resolve the question properly. And I think that they made a lot of mistakes in response to it. I think that that particular set of events can be understood. I'm sure we'll discuss them as we go along here today, but I don't think that those are properly understood as in the main, in the vast majority, at least, and perhaps at all, as a response to the mini budget. Whereas I think at the time, policymakers and certainly political and economic commentary thought that it was. That was just wrong.
Was there anything particularly radical about the mini budget in terms of the tax cuts proposed or the changes to government spending?
Probably much the largest element of the mini budget was the energy package. So there were quite large numbers involved in that, potentially into the hundreds of billions.
This is supporting users of energy, households and firms in the face of market volatility on energy prices, because of course we were at this point just 6 months after Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
That's right. So in 2022, there were very large rises in energy prices for a number of reasons, of which Russia's invasion of Ukraine was perhaps the largest. But there were also other factors such as French nuclear power stations having to undergo maintenance that they hadn't had in the COVID period and a number of other things. So there were large rises in energy prices. Those were going to cause very large rises in household energy bills in the UK, by some estimates as much as £6,000 per household. And the government decided that what it was going to do, wrongly in my view, but that was what they decided to do, was to introduce this large amount of government subsidy of household bills. There's no doubt that was quite a significant amount of money involved in that. One of the things to understand about that, though, was that was announced on September the 8th in the UK. So that was several weeks before the mini budget, and markets basically shrugged it off as nothing very much. They didn't think of that as a particularly significant event, no large market reaction. And so by the time that the mini budget came around and they mentioned that again, that was just a repeating of old news. So it's very implausible that actually what you have in the market reaction that came in the period after the mini budget was a response to that particular event. At least there's nothing about the timing that suggests that you should understand it as that event, because it was announced many weeks before and markets didn't react when it was announced.
I must say that's certainly my recollection of what happened. It's also my recollection that interest rates were going up globally around the world anyway, because we were coming out of the ultra low interest rates that we'd had since the global financial crisis of 2009, and then again after the COVID lockdown. But we did see some spike in mortgage rates, didn't we? I think that's worth explaining, Andrew.
So there was a spike in the 30-year, the long-term yield on UK government bonds.
That's the amount of money the government must pay investors, pension funds, insurance companies and so on, to borrow from them for 30 years. That's what you mean by the 30-year yield. There's also a 10-year yield. They're the two main benchmarks, aren't they?
That's right, and there are shorter-term ones as well. But this is the long-term rate of interest that the government has to pay for very long-term bonds, 30 years and more. And what tends to happen is that interest rates that are used for mortgages, the interest rates which the mortgage companies themselves use to determine what mortgage rates they should charge people, are normed to or connected to these government gilt rates. So when those go up, then there will be a tendency for mortgages to go up as well. So there probably was some adjustment at the time, because although interest rates were going up rapidly, there was uncertainty in markets about exactly where they would settle, and that led to some uncertainty about exactly what the right mortgage rate to set was, and there was some volatility on the way up. So prices rose a bit and they fell back, and they rose a bit more and they fell back. Now you got this very large spike in the period immediately following the mini budget, actually much larger than had ever occurred in the past for many decades, following any kind of fiscal event. And there was clarity about exactly how long that was going to last. And so, of course, for a while, that got reflected in interest rates. It was a very short period that got reflected, and there were very few mortgages, in fact, negotiated in that period. So when you look at the average mortgage rate that's paid in that period, you can't even notice any spike at all. That's just not visible in the aggregate data. But the offers for a short period were definitely elevated.
Now, you make very clear in your report into this whole episode that just because an event follows another event, that doesn't mean there's causation. It doesn't mean that one event caused the other. We did see a spike in mortgage rates after the mini budget. We did see a bit of a spike in gilt yields, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was because of Liz Truss and then Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng's policies, does it? Because there was also a lot going on at the Bank of England, both in terms of its regulation of so-called liability-driven investments, which I think we need to explain. But also, there's something else that I think we should explain, Andrew, because almost nobody's ever explained it in British broadcasting history, but I think between us we can. The fact that the Bank of England switched from quantitative easing to quantitative tightening. Should we take those two subjects in turn?
One of probably the single biggest thing that's going on in September 2022 to October 2022 is that you get a triggering effect. So some complex combination of other things going on, maybe some natural volatility around fiscal events. An event like the mini budget might have been expected just through speculation about what was going to happen or what might not happen to have induced movements in gilt yields of something like 30 basis points. That's 0.3%, one way of thinking about that. So it wouldn't have been odd if you'd had that kind of movement. That's absolutely typical for the period around a budget. Sometimes they're much larger. So, for example, the response to Rachel Reeves' budget in just a couple of months ago was much larger than that. So we've had more than 80, in fact, in some measures more than 100 basis points of response to that. But normally you would expect there to be about 30 basis points of response to that. So you've got that kind of thing. You've got the Bank of England didn't raise interest rates by as much as was expected by financial markets a few days before the mini budget. The dollar was very strong, and there are various other
which makes the pound weak by definition.
Exactly. So there are various other things going on in financial markets that might induce a little bit of volatility. And basically what happens is some combination of these other factors trigger a problem which was sitting there waiting to happen in financial markets because of these liability-driven investments. What does that mean? An LDI. Liability-driven investments means that the following. Pension funds, particularly ones with defined benefits, so they've got a defined amount that they've got to pay out, had come under a problem when, in the period after the financial crisis in 2008-09, the yields got to be very low on government bonds. So the normal thing that they would do is to match fixed outgoings with some fixed incomings. So they invest in some government bonds, they get yields on that, they match the terms, a similar amount of time, and they match the monies coming in to the monies going out, and everything's very clean and organized.
And that's how pension funds and insurance companies work, right?
Exactly.
They put all your massive savings to work. They invest in some things, companies. They also lend money to sound governments around the world. And that's what makes the world go round.
That's exactly how they'd always done things. But the yields got to be very low. And that meant they got fixed outgoings, and the money coming in wasn't enough to match for them to make the payments out. So they had to try to find some other way of raising the yield. And one of the things which they did, there were various things that they tried to do, but one of the things that they did here was to involve themselves in a certain kind of derivative. So think of a swap. So a particular kind of an example of this would be what's called a swap. So suppose that you, for example, had a floating rate mortgage payment and I have a fixed rate mortgage payment. Now, suppose that you imagine that the floating rate is going to go up. So if you stick with your floating rate, you're going to have to be paying out more. I, on the other hand, think that the floating rate is going to go down. So by having a fixed rate, I miss out on the opportunity for my payments to go down. What we might do is swap our payments. So You have to pay my payments and I have to pay yours, because I think that I gain by having your scheme, the floating one, and you think that you gain by having my scheme, the fixed one. Now, when you have that kind of arrangement, because it's speculative and and there's a stream of payments associated, in order to guarantee them properly, you have to provide something called collateral. So you've got to put a bit of money down there on the table, like a sort of pot. Now, when you have that kind of collateral arrangement, the amount of collateral typically depends upon how much risk there is that's going on in these things. So when the interest rates that are paid get more volatile, if they go up and down more, then there's more riskiness involved. Or if you get out of the money by more, that is, if you're in a position where your obligation ends up being higher than you had expected it to be, then more collateral ends up needing to be posted. So you've got to put more money down.
To keep the banks that are funding you happy, right?
Exactly. Now, one of the complexities with these, so you might have thought, oh, well, that's fairly straightforward. The pension funds just do that, and that's all fine and dandy. But one of the problems here is that they weren't really supposed to engage in these derivative operations at all. In some cases, regulation prevented them, and in other cases, the kind of mission statement of the pension fund forbade them from being involved in these sorts of derivative trading. Now, what they did was get around this by creating special purpose vehicles, sometimes offshore. So they create a special company, and this other company does the swap for them. And what they do is own shares in that company. Well, they put some capital into that company, so they own it, and then it does all of this other stuff, which is fancy. And because of that, they get around the obligation. Now, one of the problems with that is, because you're not posting the collateral directly, if you end up having to post any collateral, it's all very cumbersome and slow, because I've now got to get all of my ducks in a row, all of my stakeholders internally to agree. I have to post some extra capital over there, and then that has to then get turned into capital into this separate company, and that company then has to go through the business of posting the collateral. It gets even more complicated, because what actually happened was many of these companies, especially the smaller pension companies, didn't even own their own special purpose vehicle. Lots of them would get together and they'd all collectively own one special purpose vehicle. So now instead of me...
So there's a huge amount of financial engineering going on, basically, so pension funds and insurance companies in a very low interest rate environment can still earn enough returns to keep their payments going to their unsuspecting customers. That's basically what's happening.
Correct. But what's crucial to grasp is that the processes are very slow. So it's because it's complicated, it gets very slow to do it. So one of the consequences of that is, if I come under any pressure in order to post this collateral, because it's all very slow, my only chance of actually posting the collateral in time is if I have something very liquid, which I can immediately get my hands on the cash in order to get through the process in time for me to post the collateral at the other end. And so one of the consequences of that is the only practical way I can normally get hold of things very rapidly is by selling gilts.
Yeah, because the market is very liquid. There's always a market for that good as gold debt of, we like to think, solvent Western countries, the US, the UK, and so on.
Correct. That's the thing that I do to get extra collateral if I need to post it. But now we've got a very strange and perverse situation, because what happens is I've engaged in a bet on what's going to happen to interest rates, which are the gilt yields. So that's the interest rates which is paid on these government bonds. But if those government bonds get volatile in the direction of their prices fall, so the yields go up, in response to the price of the bonds falling, I have to sell them in order to get the collateral, because that's, in practical terms, the only way I can get the money fast enough. So that means as the prices start to fall, even if they fall only a little, I then am forced to sell, and that makes the prices go down further, and then I'm forced to sell again in response to that. And with only a small amount of initial movement, we can trigger a very large, sudden movement in gilt yields. And that was exactly the situation that occurred in September 2022 and into October.
So the market suddenly is flooded with gilts, flooded with government debt. That pushes down the price of that government debt, and that means the government has to pay more to borrow with the yield going up. That is one of the most fundamental relationships in economics and finance, isn't it? that when a bond price goes down, its yield goes up. This is basically first year A-level economics.
That's exactly right. Now, one other thing to grasp here is that what had happened with particularly some of those funds where lots of them had been grouped together is that they'd engaged in another kind of bet at the same time. So what they had done was to use the money because they had these swap arrangements that freed up some capital because they only have to post the collateral rather than have the whole value of the floating or fixed payment. So all that they're doing is posting a small proportion of it. They use the capital which is freed up by that to invest in equities. And that's all very well.
Stocks and shares.
Stocks and shares, exactly. So what they're doing there effectively is betting that if interest rates go up, they will go up because the real economy is doing well. That then means if the real economy is doing well, the stocks and shares in the other companies do well, and that gives them lots of money coming in. So that's a bet, So that's the way they hedge. They reduce their risk. So I bet that the interest rates won't go up, but if I'm wrong, then it's not too bad because I get lots of money in from this other source. But a problem arises if it's not that the interest rates are going up because the economy is doing well and the Bank of England is cooling down the economy, but instead the interest rates are going up because inflation's gone through the roof because the Bank of England printed a whole load of money following COVID, and then you have the Russians invading Ukraine and all the kinds of other things.
Which is what was happening in the autumn of 2022.
Exactly. So they had bet against precisely the scenario that occurred. Which was
a global macroeconomic scenario that was nothing to do with Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. It was a lot more to do with the Bank of England, right?
Insofar as it's anybody's fault, I mean, you could say that the Bank of England... I think the Bank of England makes some bad mistakes after COVID, but most of this situation gets baked in the cake by 2019. So you already have about 60% of UK defined benefit schemes are participating in these things by 2019.
Just to explain that, most of our pucker gold-plated pension schemes are basically invested in these liability-driven investments. They're using debt to try and magnify their returns. That's the fundamental point, right? In a low-yield world, they're using debt to try and magnify their returns.
And leverage. They're multiplying up. So one little bit of debt they post, they then are effectively exposed to many times that amount of debt
which is great if it goes right, but if it goes wrong, we're in deep doo-doo.
That's right.
Now, your report, Andrew, we must make this cardinal point. This is a point that has sort of broken through into the mainstream news, but it often gets lost if it's not within discussions among sort of technical nerds like you and I. The Bank of England, to its credit, actually wrote a report, didn't it, in which it tried to ascribe how much of the spike in gilt yields after the mini budget was attributable to Liz Truss's policies and how much of the spike in borrowing costs after the mini budget was attributable to the fact that these liability-driven investments, which our regulators had not stopped, they'd sort of turned a blind eye, how much they contributed it. And while this is an inexact science, even the Bank of England said that around 2/3 of the spike in gilt yields was due to those liability-driven investments.
Exactly right, yes. And then 1/3 is just the rest, everything else. Some of which now they might think some of that might be the mini budget, but it's other factors are causing it. So they think that what happens is you get a small initial impetus, and then that triggers a much larger problem because our larger problem was a problem waiting to happen. Now, a thing to grasp here is that this isn't a situation in which it's that the mini budget involves some kind of creating a sovereign debt crisis, and then once you get a sovereign debt crisis, lots of other things might get magnified. This is the other way around. I mean, though I liken it in the report to suppose that I have a balloon that I've overinflated and it's almost on the point of bursting. So the plastic's so thin that when even just the heat of the sun will cause the balloon to explode. It's not the heat of the sun that's caused the explosion. It's the overinflation of the balloon that's caused the explosion. The heat of the sun is just the trigger. So even insofar as the mini budget would be the trigger, which I don't think is by any means clear, there are lots of other potential things which might have been the trigger, that the that isn't really the cause of what's going on here. It's not merely that the vast majority of the effect is liability-driven investments, it's that the mini-budget isn't even the cause. One thing that I'd like to just note about this is that at the time, a lot of the commentary seemed to understand that the problem was some kind of sovereign debt crisis. They thought that financial markets had lost confidence in the UK government's ability or the certainty with which it would repay its debts. So they were selling the bonds because they thought, oh, well, there's all this, some kind of, large deficit, or maybe the various bits of the political system are all falling out with each other, with Liz Truss criticising the Bank of England and not having an OBR report and firing the head of the Treasury, that kind of thing. So they say the way that people told the story at the time was the gilt yields are going up because nobody wants UK government bonds because they don't trust the government to repay its debts. And an important thing to understand is that is demonstrably wrong. We know that's false now. And the reason we know that's false is because when you have a sovereign debt crisis, there are two kinds of things two elements to that in a country like the UK, which borrows in its own currency and prints its own currency. And those two elements are that you might default on your sovereign debt by not paying a coupon. You just don't pay the interest, so you default. The other way you could do it would be you promise to pay, implying a certain inflation rate, and then you inflate away the value of the debt. So that was kind of what we did in the 1970s. We got rid of quite a lot of the debt that we'd had at the end of World War II by running much higher inflation for quite a long time, and that solved that problem. Now, the thing to grasp is that in the September 2022, October 2022 events, there was no move whatsoever in inflation expectations. And what that tells us is, unless you were going to claim that people thought that there was 100% chance that the UK government wasn't going to pay a coupon and 0% chance that they'd raise inflation, I mean, that's preposterous. Obviously, the main thing that you would worry about, if you worried about the fiscal solvency of the UK government, would be that inflation would go up. That's what people always worry about. But we know from the financial market prices that there was no shift in the inflation expectations. So we know that it wasn't a sovereign debt crisis. So that kind of advice given to Liz Truss and so on, that people had lost confidence in the
which is basically what the Treasury was telling her, right? Exactly. She's written about it in her book. The Treasury was saying, if you don't desist, there's going to be a sovereign debt crisis.
Exactly, and that's just wrong. Now, it may be that it's understandable given the volatility and things in the markets at the time that people believed that was the issue. But we know now from the data that was just false. It wasn't a sovereign debt crisis. And in fact, bodies like the IMF and the Bank of England and others all refer to it now not as the sovereign debt crisis of September, October 2022, but as the liability-driven investments crisis, because they accept that that's the cause.
So among professional economists, there really is clarity on this. And this is we're at the outer reaches here, Andrew. This is the world in which you and I operate, right? This is a mainstream media podcast. We're having quite a technical discussion, and you are doing a heroic job of trying to keep it on the kind of analytical straight and narrow to keep a broad audience with us. And I'm going to take a risk here because I just want to mention for completeness the other aspect of this episode that is part of what the Bank of England's role in it wasn't just the regulation or otherwise of liability-driven investments. The Bank of England also decided just a few days before the mini-budget to announce that rather than buying bonds from the market, which is what quantitative easing is, they were going to actually start selling government bonds back into the market, so-called quantitative tightening, trying to mop up after all the madness of the global financial crisis. And I would say, Andrew, to do that, to announce that you're going to start selling lots of government debt into the market as a central bank, when you know a Prime Minister and Chancellor are about to launch a budget which will also involve the selling of quite a lot of debt, that's a pretty irresponsible thing to do.
Whether it's responsible or irresponsible, I can understand why you would think it was irresponsible. A thing I would note on that is when other central banks tried that, there ended up being events like, they call it the taper tantrum, for example, when the Federal Reserve attempted it. So when other central banks tried to exit QE and move into QT, the quantitative tightening, that's the selling the bonds instead of buying them, it was quite often the case that there was for a short period, some volatility, some spikes in the yields on their government securities. So it would not be surprising at all if a key element of that initial movement that then is greatly elevated by the LDI problem was actually the quantitative shift to quantitative tightening, because that was what had happened in other countries. And it's odd that given that's what's happened in other countries, and that happened at exactly the same time as the mini budget, that so many people assume it's the mini budget that's the thing that's causing these events, rather than the shift to QT, which would be, in any other circumstances, the most natural candidate.
Andrew, just finally, in a nutshell, how honest is it for politicians within the Tory party, within the Labour Party, whatever party they're in, how honest is it analytically to say that Liz Truss crashed the economy?
I think it's manifestly false. And I don't think any politically neutral economist would take any other view. The economy didn't crash. There wasn't any crash in the economy. The economy actually grew faster in the period immediately following the mini budget. In fact, the month following the mini budget was the fastest that had occurred since the COVID. And it was faster than it had been occurring. That was in an environment in which the Bank of England had been, only a month or so earlier, forecasting 6 consecutive quarters of contraction. So it's not as though the economy was expected to go really fast and Liz Truss made it go a little bit slower than was expected. The things that happened immediately following the mini budget was that the economy performed well. So it's just preposterous to claim that she crashed the economy. Exactly the opposite happened. The economy did better than had been expected. It's also preposterous in the sense that there wasn't any loss. So the Bank of England intervened to try to calm down the liability-driven investments crisis in September, October 2022. And many people may be aware, they'll have heard of this number of 70 billion or so of the Bank of England intervention at the time. Well, the Bank of England made a profit on the monies which it put in. It didn't actually put in anything like that full 70 billion, it just made it available. But the monies it did put in, it made a profit. So it wasn't that she cost the economy anything either. There were no enduring economic effects of these events. The main enduring effects are, of course, political, and this strange idea that any attempt to reform and make the economy grow faster by having some sort of pro-growth policies or cutting taxes or tax reforms, these are all things which markets have rejected. That's just not right at all, and I think obviously not right. The mini-budget involved repeating a lot of measures which had already been announced many months before and that markets had shrugged off. The amount of things that were new in the money budget was absolutely tiny, just a few £1 billion. It's wildly implausible that they could be responsible for the yield spike that occurred in the period after the mini budget. And it's obvious that there was no sovereign debt crisis. We know that because inflation expectations didn't rise, and they would have risen if there'd been a sovereign debt crisis. And analytically, we now know what the cause was of the October 2022 events. It was problems with liability-driven investments in the pension funds market. All of these things are clear, and it's, I think, quite ridiculous that people keep repeating this idea that Liz Truss crashed the economy when it's so obviously false.
Andrew Lilico, thanks a lot for joining us on Planet Normal. Well, there you have it, Allison. We have taken a bit of a risk here on Planet Normal this week. I've presented you there and our listeners with really quite a technical discussion between myself and someone who I think I can objectively say is one of the very best people in the country when it comes to explaining really complex ideas to a broad audience. Andrew Lilico has written, he's not a newspaper columnist like you and I, but he's written hundreds of newspaper columns. He's very, very good at talking about extremely difficult and arcane, but very, very important financial subjects to a broad audience. He's widely respected across the political spectrum, even though he is a broadly centre-right, small state person. We should also say, for clarity, as I intimated in the introduction, that the report he did into the autumn of 2022 was part of Liz Truss's submission to Keir Starmer. Having said that, Andrew Lilico is not going to put his name to anything that he isn't absolutely happy about in terms of its analytical validity and its sort of scientific, factual basis. So I think what he's done there, and I think listeners and yourself have indulged me a little bit here for us to run an interview like that. But I think what Andrew Lilico has done has tried to inject into our political and media class via Planet Normal an absolutely bulletproof case for why, as you know, some of us have been saying since it happened, it's absolutely mad. Whatever you think of her, it's absolutely mad and deeply dishonest to say that Liz Truss crashed the economy. And why do I put myself out there? Why have I put myself out there since then? I've endured massive opprobrium from all kinds of people, many of whom are very close to me, for, why do you defend Liz Truss? Why? I defend what Liz Truss did, not because she's Liz Truss. I defend what she did because her ideas are really, really important. And over many years and decades, it's completely clear to me that economies work best when taxation is kept under control, when government debt is kept under control. Smaller states tend to work better than larger states. They tend to deliver more economic growth, more economic prosperity, a bigger pie that we can then argue over how we share it out. And I think what's happened in the aftermath of that mini budget, her and her Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, who is somebody who I also think is intellectually of the first rank, by the way, somebody who has also been maligned. They didn't do everything perfectly. I criticised them heavily at the time. I'm proud of what I wrote at the time for the way they presented things, the fact that they played fast and loose with British financial institutions. I think there was a lot of kind of political point scoring going on. I personally wouldn't have removed the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, from the process. I said at the time that that would lead to alarm on financial markets. But their ideas, in my view, are not only valid, their ideas are wildly overdue, given that taxation was at a 70-year high when Labour came into office. Government debt was pushing 100% of GDP. And what we've seen over the last 6 months, particularly since the October 31st budget, is financial markets have reacted extremely badly to Labour's policies. As we record, Allison, literally as I'm talking to you and Planet Normal listeners now, I'm watching like a hawk, as I have been for the last 3 or 4 months, the 10-year yield on UK government bonds. Yeah, that doesn't sound arcane. I'm not going to apologise because, it's mathematics. I'm not going to apologise at all because this is really important stuff. The 10-year yield is now way above where it was at the height of the mini-budget panic. The 10-year yield has gone up sharply throughout this week because it's clear to the markets, as many of us warned, that Labour's high tax policies and the chance of more taxes to come are not engendering growth. They're thwarting growth. And with less growth, there's less tax revenue and high government spending and promises of more government spending to come. That opens up the public finances badly. Our tax revenues will fall way short of our government spending. That will mean even more borrowing. Gilt yields will go up even more. And that will push up whatever the Bank of England does. The Bank of England has been lowering rates during all this period, but the markets have been pushing rates up. And that's those market interest rates. The media almost never explains this. It's those market interest rates, not the Bank of England's interest rates. It's the market's interest rates which determine the cost of your personal loans, the cost of your mortgage, the cost of finance for not just for governments, but for companies that want to borrow, to invest, to create jobs, to create growth. So it's a long interview, it's a technical interview, but I would say, and I'm grateful for your support in this, it's an important interview that mainstream journalists have to get their head around if they are going to understand British politics over the next 3 to 6 months.
Well, I know how passionate you feel about this, and you have been educating me about the debt repayments, the interest payments on our debt, which are so catastrophically high. I think you said that they are 2 or 3 times the defence budget now. Is that right?
Yeah, they were due to be around £80 billion a year, and now we're looking at £120 billion.
Well, we have to ask various things. Let's just tackle this head on. So people will think, oh, Liz Truss, a former prime minister, very briefly prime minister, sending a legal cease and desist letter to the current prime minister, telling him not to claim that Liz Truss crashed the economy. Now, at one level, people will think, well, it's a bit crazy, isn't it?
They'll think, is this lawfare like they have in America? Why are we using the courts to have political discussions?
That's right. But as you say, firstly, Rachel from Accounts and her first stab at a budget, which is coming apart. And if anyone saw, I was watching Prime Minister's Questions today because of the grooming gangs discussion today, Wednesday. I wanted to see how Kemi did. And Rachel Reeves sat there. I mean, the woman looks gaunt. She looks like she's seen the ghost of her own economic disaster, quite honestly. And you could look at the media for a long time and see no criticism or hardly any criticism of her. So there are these, that while Liz Truss, as you say, Liam, was ridiculed, and indeed her lawyers are now claiming were defamed by saying, oh, lazily, stupid people in the media who haven't familiarized themselves with the details, lazily saying, oh, yes, she did this and it crashed the economy. Now, to be fair, I think we should say that she tried to do too much too quickly in that mini budget. Certainly, I thought that they going to reduce the 45% rate to 40%. You can argue, as many economists do, that the 45% rate doesn't make that much for the exchequer, which is fair enough. But politically,
in a cost of living crisis, that was politically tin-eared, as I said at the time. Literally, as she said it, I said it on television. That's politically tin-eared. Even though a 40% top rate of tax is probably going to raise you more money than a 45% rate of tax.
But it didn't look good. And I think even Kwasi Kwarteng and some of the other people around her said, hang on a minute, hold your horses. Let's not do, 10 of my favourite things immediately. But she was in a hurry. I think she felt as Prime Minister, she only had, the term was running out, wasn't it? So she probably felt she really wanted to get the kind of rocket boosters onto this clearly struggling economy. Now, it's interesting, Liam, because I've got the cease and desist letter in front of me, and as well as obviously Andrew Lilico's very, very strong technical arguments, it says here that there were, after the King's speech, there were these briefing notes corrections. So that on the 17th of July 2024, the Cabinet Office published briefing notes which included words similar to Liz Truss crashed the economy, although less trenchant than the defamatory words complained of in this letter. Now, the briefing, which was used for the King's speech, referred to the mistakes of Liz Truss's mini budget. Now, Liz Truss wrote to Simon Case at the Cabinet Office at that point. You remember that he was the secretary there at the Cabinet Office.
Yeah, Britain's most senior civil servant.
Pointing out that the reference to the mistakes of the mini budget were both untrue and inappropriate. And this is the key line in the legal letter, Liam. The offending words were immediately removed without further argument. And I think this comes to a broader theme here. We've talked at the top of the podcast about the institutional failure, arrogance, complacency. Obviously, in that case, it was, couldn't have been more serious. It was leading to the abuse of children. But we see something similar here, I think, not entirely dissimilar, which is this overpowerful institutions not playing fair by the public, not being honest with the public. We've seen an overpowerful Treasury, which I think wanted to go its own sweet way. I think they're probably delighted that they've got Rachel from Accounts to push around rather than Liz Truss, who is 10 times the intellect of the present Chancellor of the Exchequer. So I think that we have got very serious question marks now about the integrity of the Bank of England, about the integrity of the Treasury, and people in the media who jumped on the Liz Truss was useless bandwagon. I was just going to say I'm not an economist, but we know that's no longer true, isn't it? Your co-pilot has been picking up.
You've got a better grasp now of bond markets and government finances, I have to say, than plenty of frontline economic journalists that I know. Let me just say that. I won't embarrass them by naming them. I'm too nice a guy. But that is my professional opinion.
Well, just under your tutelage, I would say, under your skillful tutelage, I would say that I can see that much of that Rachel Reeves's budget has had, absolutely catastrophic dampening effect. And just from personal anecdote, speaking to people in our town, where I was told over the last couple of weeks about 3 pretty good businesses are closing, right? They just can't face the forthcoming, both the rise in the minimum wage, coupled with the huge increase in the employers' national insurance contributions. This is from a Labour government which said that its central purpose was going to be growth. It's an absolute farce. And as you say, Liam, Liz Truss may have made some errors of presentation and may have been over ambitious. But I really welcome this letter to Keir Starmer, because let them explain how their handling of the economy is better than Liz's, because it looks to me a damn sight worse.
Let me just finish by saying 2 things. The first thing to say is that there are many very distinguished financial journalists who do really understand financial markets in the US. I would say, I think the Telegraph's coverage of this episode, by the way, has been excellent, but I think it's been an exception. I think our broadcasters have been completely asleep and all too gleefully willing to jump on the Liz Truss crash the economy bandwagon, because pretty much every frontline broadcaster I know who broadcasts in this subject area basically hates Liz Truss and everything that she stands for: small state, low tax, and so on. And I don't apologise for saying that. And if they want to debate with me public on that, anytime, any place, anywhere, they know where to find me. The Wall Street Journal is a case in point. It has really got hold of this story. The Wall Street Journal, obviously our rival publication, but I don't mind saying, just as I don't mind saying that Andrew Norfolk at the Times did a brilliant job on the grooming gangs, absolutely world-class reporting, hugely brave. There you go. The Times, our direct rival here in the UK. I tip my hat to him, and I know that you do too. The Wall Street Journal over the pond in the States has really got hold of this story and has actually made a documentary about claims that Liz Truss crashed the economy, and has dismantled those claims with expert testimony from a lot of people who know what they're talking about. And the second thing I'd say is that since early September, Allison, the 30-year gilt yield, that story again, has gone in the UK from 4.35 to today, as we speak, Wednesday, it's now 5.37, right? What does that mean? It means that actual borrowing costs in the market that will be reflected in mortgage costs, personal loan costs, and corporate funding for business expansion have gone up by 100 basis points, by a whole percentage point, even though during the same period, the Bank of England has lowered the base rate from 5.25 to 4.75. So the Bank of England is lowering its main interest rate, which is meant to provide a base for every other interest rate in the economy, and yet the market is going completely in the other direction. And I say this with trepidation, and I say this with a very heavy heart, Allison. Having studied financial markets and written about financial markets to a broad audience for quite a few decades now, I'm older than I look, especially with the weight loss. When you have a situation where policymakers, the Bank of England, are lowering rates and the market is thumbing their nose and raising rates, the rates that actually count in the economy, that is a big danger signal. That shows that market expectations have become what economists call unanchored from the policy regime. That puts markets in direct conflict with policymakers. And one of the great lessons from history is that the markets always win.
Liam, I just want to ask you a woman on the Clapham Omnibus question.
When were you last on a bus?
I'm usually on a treadmill now, as you know. Oh, there we go. And you do look pretty snappy, actually. 10 years younger. One of our regular favourite people on X, a guy called Burnside, just tweeted, He's given us a graph of this thing that you've been talking about so knowledgeably with Andrew, which is the 30-year Treasury gilt auction bond yield. And he says, this is Burnside, these kind of moves usually presage an imminent widespread financial catastrophe. Rachel Reeves should be summoned to the House to explain herself. I know you're very responsible about these things and you don't like being alarmist, but how bad could it be?
Well, all I'd say is that my WhatsApp feed is, as well as messages from my kids and lots of my closest friends, my WhatsApp feed is also peppered with messages, not just from top politicians. I'm not saying this to boast, it's just my life, but it's also now inundated with messages from people I know well in financial markets and people I trust. And they are saying to me stuff I can't say on a family show. Yeah. What the XXXX are the politicians doing? Why aren't the Tories all over this? Why isn't Rachel Reeves being torn limb from limb by the opposition front bench? This is a big moment of danger, I would say, for our financial markets and therefore for the British economy. I know political and media class has been rightly fixated over the last few days on the scandal that you spoke about so eloquently at the top of this show, and rightly. I'm not saying we shouldn't be talking about that. But what I'm saying to our media bosses, particularly our broadcast bosses, we have to start talking about this stuff. We have to give the British public the benefit of the doubt. They are not thick. They want to know about this stuff. People come up to me all the time and ask me about this kind of stuff because a lot of people remember 1976. As recently as that, in my lifetime, the British government had to be bailed out. And I'm not saying that we're at that point yet. I'm not saying that we're going to see a repeat of that. But what I am saying, with direct evidence, is that people in financial markets who will determine whether or not that happens are now talking about it. Now on to our listener emails. Your messages sent to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We learn so much from you, the citizens of Planet Normal.
Well, we've predictably, I suppose, Liam, had a flood of emails and messages about the grooming gangs and we're now going to call them the child rape gangs, as we decided to dispense with platitudes. Marie says, I would like to draw your attention to the much heralded Jay report into child sexual abuse. There were complaints made at the time regarding the ridiculously wide yet shallow terms of reference, objectors claiming it would end up being a whitewash, which I have to say after 8 years and millions of pounds it has turned out to be. Notably, the short form of the Jay report, which is posted on the government website, does not mention the words Pakistani or Muslim once. It does, however, castigate the Church of England, the Roman Catholic Church, Cyril Smith and Jimmy Savile, both of whom died more than 10 years before publication of the report, to ensure there was no investigation into the crimes, behaviours or beliefs of various Muslim communities in the UK, says Mary. And that, Liam, just to remind listeners, is why the Labour government insisting that they will enforce the recommendations of the Jay report. The Jay report, next time you hear one of them saying we're going to act on the recommendations of the Jay report, just bear in mind that it doesn't touch on the systemic abuse, the mafia-like behaviour of these criminal child rape gangs. And this is from Claire. I think you'll like this, Liam. The white working class was never under the spell of multiculturalism, says Claire. We lived it and could see what was to come. We did try to warn the rest of the country, but we were just dismissed as racists. Most of us were not racist at all and had been brought up with very good friends from all races. Unlike our middle class accusers, of course, there is a huge difference between race and culture. We tried to tell you that, says Claire. And this is from Dan, one of our frequent correspondents, Liam, army officer, Dan, not his real name. Dan says, I chose a military career in the belief that our great nation and the freedom of our citizens were worth defending against the threat posed back then by an aggressive Soviet Union as well as various terrorist groups. In that long career, I was aware that there were quirks and imperfections in our systems, but that overall the police, security services, judiciary and local government structures were still about as good as it gets in a liberal democracy. I lost a few friends due to terrorist attacks, and my family bore the stress of me being away on 4 operational tours. But I left the job satisfied that along with the soldiers I had the privilege to command, I had made a small contribution to the security of the British people in a turbulent world. The ongoing revelations this week that the depraved activities of rape gangs in so many of our towns and cities were either passively or actively being concealed or even defended by those who had a sworn duty to protect the public has, for the first time, says Dan, shaken my confidence that I served a fair and just society that was worth defending. And equally disturbing are the efforts by some to curtail our freedom of speech and to speak out and name the evil in our midst. It is sadly too late for the thousands of young girls who were violently abused, but not too late for a wide-ranging and forensic inquiry to hold to account those who fail to protect them. Never again must be the aim now.
Very strong. Okay, this is from Allison. Allison with 1 L, unlike Alison Pearson. Happy New Year, Allison, 2 L's, and Liam. You've both been missed over the festive period. Thank you so much for bringing much needed light relief every Thursday and providing reasoned common sense to combat the wokery, madness and nonsensical decisions taken by those in power. Having voted Tory for the past 30 years, my husband and I joined Reform in November. Last Friday evening, we joined 1,000 other patriotic Brits determined to stand up for what used to be a hard-working and pride-inspiring country by heading off to Leicester to hear Nigel Farage, Richard Tice, Lee Anderson, Dame Andrea Jenkins, Marco Longy, etc. Those last 3 former Tory MPs who have defected to Reform, speak convincingly and passionately from the heart about topics integral to our broken country: the NHS education, net zero hypocrisies, lack of crime deterrent, failing social care, as well as communicating a host of different ways we can all help to support the party. A particularly noteworthy speaker, undoubtedly worth a future Planet Normal invite, was Joseph Baum, the 22-year-old North West Leicestershire chair who, only a couple of weeks ago, had never before addressed an audience of more than 20 people. A standing ovation ensued, reports Allison. Watch this space. Before we'd even arrived at the venue, she reports, the hollowing of around 100 Palestinian flag-bearing, full mask-wearing and hood-donning thugs could be heard. It was a scary and intimidating sight. Refugees welcome here placards and no to racism banners were waved around, and their slogans were chanted, while my husband had shame on you and racist violently screamed at him through a megaphone. We were then separated as we were jostled through the crowd, trying desperately to make our way to the venue's entrance and reunite. Is Britain a free country where normal folk like you and us can vote for whom we deem fit and exercise our freedoms, or one that's ruled by the mob? The absolute irony of this violent and abusive crowd pressuring ordinary law-abiding people by trying to prevent them going about their business while accusing them of being racist was truly shocking. A peaceful protest this was definitely not. Unfortunately, says Allison, in the audience was an ardent and vocal Tommy Robinson fan who tried to interrupt the speakers on a couple of occasions. Nigel Farage is absolutely right in saying it would not be appropriate for him to rejoin Reform UK. Before I sign off, I have a request. Please, please, please hold a Planet Normal live event in the Midlands.
Oh.
We're avid listeners, so now are several friends, and have been since day one. We'd love to attend a gathering in person. Keep up the great work. Allison.
Well, we would love to do. We'd love to do an event, perhaps a Midlands pub, Liam. What do you think?
I know plenty of them.
This is an email from our lovely GP, Planet Normal GP, Dr. Claire, has been casting a slightly cynical eye over Labour's plans to improve the NHS. Dr. Claire says, just to wish you both a very happy new year. Try and avoid policemen, Alison. I will, Claire, I will. Thank you so much for all you both do. You are such an important voice for the voiceless. She says, what a year. Interestingly, this week, says Claire, I met a young woman from Kazakhstan who was in the UK for a 2-week English course. She said she was shocked at one, our energy prices. They have plentiful gas and oil, and their bills are in pence rather than in thousands of pounds. She noticed English people have cold houses as they turn the heat down to save money. In her country, they keep warm as energy is so cheap. I told her we have plentiful gas and oil in the North Sea, but aren't allowed to use it. 2, our food prices shocked the lady from Afghanistan. Related to energy prices in Kazakhstan, their food prices are low. 3, how dirty and litter-strewn London is. 4, how unsafe she felt in London. 5, how many Muslim women in London were covered. And 6, how very expensive everything in the UK is, including travel. I think, Liam, that's going to be a big theme in the year ahead. I think that energy prices and so on, and the general cost of living, that it's really impacting people now.
Okay, 2 from me to end. A quick one from Neil, because we want to carry on talking about VAT on education, of course.
Yeah.
Labour have introduced VAT on school fees, which many independent schools have been forced to pass on, at least in part, with fees going up in some cases by 15 or even the full 20%. Of course, many parents who send their kids to independent schools are not wealthy at all. Many independent schools aren't wealthy, and we both feel quite strongly about this. Neil says, as VAT on education is illegal in Europe, could a legal challenge to this not be mounted via the ECHR? At the very least, it may slow everything down until Nigel and co take over, says Neil. I must also congratulate Allison in particular for her makeover. I saw the other evening on GB News, and I wasn't sure if it was her. Allison, you looked fab, said Neil. And I can say to Neil that a group of independent schools are indeed, as previously forecast on Planet Normal, going down that route of mounting a legal challenge against that increase on school fees via VAT. And to round off an episode which has been pretty harrowing, I think we have to say, we've covered in some detail not just the child rape scandal, I think we should be calling it. I do agree with you, Alison. Yes. The grooming scandal is far too woolly in terms of labelling and indeed issues with government finances. Let's have a little bit of light and shade. We started with your stunning, marginal victory in our weight loss competition. And let's end with a Planet Normal poem. Happy New Year, Alison and Liam. With due deference to Bob the Bard. This is from Richard. Happy New Year, Alison and Liam, says Richard. With due deference to Bob the Bard, who is, of course, Planet Normal listener, not his real name, who has submitted countless fantastic poems. Richard says, I present my poem, The New Winter of Discontent. I remember the Winter of Discontent in 1978-79, says Richard, when Uncle Jim Callaghan's Labour government began to fall apart. Now I feel a new winter of discontent approaching, when those who voted Labour will bitterly regret their decision. My mother, who lived to the grand old age of 102, always said that she voted for Labour once after the war, quote, but never again. It seems that every generation has to relearn that lesson, hence my poem. And here it is. 'Twas the middle of winter, and old Fred the farmer was cursing our Rachel and swearing at Starmer. He couldn't calm down, he couldn't relax, because of the vicious inheritance tax. And all round the country the pensioners froze, no heating to warm up their fingers and toes, because ruthless Rachel lost all sense of balance, and this winter left them with no fuel allowance. Good one. Meanwhile, the blob holds a midwinter party, but only for those of the true wokerati. You will not get in, you'll be given a ban, if you say that a woman can't change to a man. Adenoid Ed thinks he's some kind of hero for forcing us all down the road to net zero, replacing the fields and the forests so green with pylons and panels and turbine machines. But when there's no wind and the sun doesn't shine, the lights will go out for hours at a time. Taxes are rising, confidence falling, free speech is at risk, the economy's stalling. So if you voted Labour, you're learning a lesson. It leads to depression, repression, recession. Ta-da! Some great wordsmithery there from Richard. Thank you so much, and keep those Planet Normal poems coming in. And on that bombshell, that's it from Planet Normal for another week, as we leave our sanctuary of sweet reason, our flying refuge of reasoned views. Email of the week, co-pilot.
Oh, God, no.
Surely it has to be the man who called you fab on GB News. Surely. Objectively speaking.
I might be lured by sly blandishments and compliments. Yes, of course I am.
So there you have it.
Neil,
send us your... I can't believe you just did that, but you did anyway. And you won the bet, even though I lost more absolute weight. But anyway, I accept. We accept that.
We accept.
Neil, send us to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk your postal address. Put mug winner in the subject heading of the email, and a Planet Normal mug will be winging its way to you.
If you enjoy Planet Normal this year, we hope you very much do. We've got some great guests lined up for you, and we'll be keeping you posted as our figures become like a biro refill.
Weight loss competition round 2 is coming.
Well, I'm weightlifting now, of course, so that's taking me into an entirely different league. Please subscribe to this podcast and leave us a rating and review on Spotify, the podcast app, or wherever you listen. It does help others to find us so the magnificent Planet Normal family can grow.
And as we speed away from our beloved Planet Normal and the madness of Planet Earth comes back into view, thanks as ever to our producers Isabel Bazard, Cass Ho and Louisa Wells. Stay safe and in touch with us and with each other. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.